The dust in the town square hung thick in the hot midday air, stirred up by the restless movement of boots, horses, and wooden carts. The small frontier town of Red Willow had not seen a gathering this large in years. Men lined the rough wooden fence that formed a half-circle around the auction platform. Some spat tobacco into the dirt. Others leaned on the rails, eyes sharp with curiosity, hunger, or something darker. A few women watched from a distance, whispering behind gloved hands. At the center of it all stood Clara Whitmore. She was barely 23, though grief had carved deeper lines into her face than her years deserved. Her dark dress was plain and worn at the hem, the fabric faded from too many washings. In her arms, she held her baby, Eli, only 6 months old, his tiny fingers clutching at her dress, as if sensing the fear in her chest. Clara's hands trembled. Though she tried to keep her back straight, she refused to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. 2 weeks earlier, she had still been a wife. Her husband, Thomas Whitmore, had been a quiet man, a wheat farmer who worked harder than anyone Clara had ever known. He had died quickly, kicked by a spooked horse in the fields, his skull striking a stone before anyone could reach him. The town doctor said he never felt the pain, but Clara felt all of it now. The ache was constant, sharp as winter ice. Thomas had left behind debts, bad ones. The land, the house, even the tools had all been taken to settle what he owed the mercantile and the bank. Clara had pleaded, begged for time. But time was not something the frontier showed mercy over. A widow with no family nearby and a baby in her arms was not considered a person worth patience. When the last coin was taken from her pocket, the town council decided her fate in a cold, official voice. She and her baby were to be auctioned as indentured labor. It was legal, people said. Practical, they said. A way for her to earn her keep instead of becoming a burden. To Clara, it felt like a death sentence. The auctioneer climbed onto the wooden platform and cleared his throat. He was a tall man with thinning hair and a stiff collar, clearly uncomfortable, but determined to hide it. He lifted his gavel, scanning the crowd. "Now bring her forward," he said. A town deputy guided Clara closer to the platform. She clutched Eli tighter. The baby began to fuss, sensing the tension, and a small cry escaped his lips. The sound cut through the crowd like a blade. "Mama's here," Clara whispered, voice shaking. "Mama's here." The auctioneer's voice rang out. "You all know the situation. Widow of Thomas Whitmore, no remaining property. 1 infant child included. Terms are clear. 1 year of service, room and board provided. Bidding will begin at $5. A low murmur passed through the crowd. $5. That was the value placed on her life, on her child's life. A man with a heavy beard lifted his hand. "5, he called casually. "5 I have," the auctioneer echoed. "Do I hear 6? Another hand went up. 6. 7, another voice added, laughter in it. Clara's stomach twisted with every rising number. She did not know which was worse, the idea of being sold cheaply or expensively. Either way, she was being bought like livestock. She stared at the dirt beneath her feet so she would not have to meet their eyes. She imagined the futures being silently calculated in the men's minds. Who would make her work the hardest? Who would shove her into a corner of a barn? Who would see her as property in every sense of the word? Her grip tightened on her baby. A voice near the front called out, "8." The auctioneer nodded briskly. $8. Do I hear 9? The crowd shifted. Some lost interest. Others leaned in now that the price had risen. Clara heard snatches of conversation, crude jokes, speculation about whether she was strong enough, comments about her appearance that burned her with humiliation. Then a drunk ranch hand laughed and said loudly, "She ain't worth 10 with the mouth feed she carries." The words hit Clara like a slap. She felt her throat close, tears stinging her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She would not weep in front of them. 9, someone finally called. 9 I have, the auctioneer said, going once. A pause. The air shifted. From the far edge of the crowd came the sound of slow, heavy boots crunching into the dirt. Heads turned. Whispering moved through the men in a ripple. A tall figure stepped forward. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in a dust-covered brown coat and a battered hat pulled low over his eyes. The sun caught the faint silver of stubble on his jaw. He carried the smell of leather, horse sweat, and open plains with him. A stranger. Everyone could tell by the way the townsfolk studied him. Clara did not look up at first. The auctioneer hesitated. "Sir, are you bidding?" The man's voice was deep and steady when he answered. 10. The number landed heavily in the square. Several men scowled. One muttered a curse under his breath. $10, the auctioneer repeated, surprised. "Do I hear 11? The bearded man who had started the bidding narrowed his eyes at the newcomer. "You don't look like you're from Red Willow," he said loudly. "You sure you know what you're buying?" The stranger's gaze never wavered. "I know exactly what I'm doing." His eyes finally met Clara's. For the first time since the auction had begun, she lifted her head. Their gazes locked across the space. There was no hunger in his expression, no mockery. What she saw instead startled her. Resolve, and something quieter beneath it. Something like protectiveness. Her pulse stuttered. $10 going once, the auctioneer called. 11, the bearded man growled. 15, the stranger replied immediately. Gasps rippled through the crowd. $15 was far more than anyone had expected. Some men laughed nervously now. Others grew irritated, sensing the auction slipping from their grasp. The bearded man hesitated, then spat into the dirt. "Damn it! 16. The stranger didn't hesitate this time either. 20. Silence fell. $20 was a fortune for an indenture auction. No one countered. The bearded man shook his head slowly. "You're a fool," he muttered. $20 going once, the auctioneer said, voice higher with excitement. "Going twice." Before he could finish, the stranger took one more step forward, his voice cutting cleanly through the heat and dust. "I'll take them both." The square froze. The auctioneer blinked. "Sir, the child is included by default." "I know," the cowboy said. "That's what I meant." His gaze never left Clara. "I said," he repeated evenly, "I'll take them both." A strange hush settled over the crowd. Even the horses seemed to quiet, shifting their weight softly, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. "Sold," the auctioneer finally declared, slamming the gavel down. "To the gentleman for $20. The sound echoed through the square. And just like that, it was over. Clara's knees nearly gave out beneath her. The deputy untied the thin rope that had marked her as property and stepped aside. The stranger approached slowly, as if careful not to startle her. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a calm gray, steady as stone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he tipped his hat slightly. "My name's Caleb Hart," he said. "You won't be mistreated under my roof. I give you my word." Clara searched his face for lies. She found none she could read. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Why?" Caleb glanced at the baby nestled against her chest. Eli had gone quiet now, wide-eyed and curious, small fingers gripping Clara's collar. "Because no woman and child should ever stand on that block," he said simply. Not like that. The words were not poetic. They were not dramatic. But to Clara, they were the first kindness she had heard in weeks. As he turned and gestured toward the edge of town where his horse waited, she tightened her arms around her son. Not in fear this time, but in fragile, trembling relief. The auction of her life was over. But the story of what that purchase would truly mean had only just begun. The town of Red Willow disappeared behind them in a blur of dust and low hills, its crooked rooftops shrinking as Caleb urged his horse into a steady trot along the westbound trail. Clara rode behind him on the same saddle, her arms wrapped tightly around Eli, her cheek pressed against the baby's warm head. The afternoon sun hung low and fierce in the sky, scorching the earth with the kind of heat that made the air shimmer. Every jolt of the trail reminded her how unreal everything felt. Only hours ago, she had stood on a wooden block waiting to be sold. Now she was riding out of town with a stranger who had paid $20 for her life and her child. Caleb kept one hand on the reins and one lightly hooked behind him against the saddle horn for balance. He rode with quiet confidence, as if guiding two fragile lives across miles of uncertain land was as natural as breathing. He did not speak at first, as if understanding that Clara needed silence more than questions. The sound of hooves, leather creaking, and wind brushing the grass was the only rhythm keeping her steady. After several miles, Caleb finally spoke. "We'll reach my place before dark if the trail holds." His voice was calm, almost gentle. Clara swallowed. "How far is it?" "Another 2 hours. Maybe less." She nodded, though her throat felt tight. Every instinct told her to stay alert, to memorize turns in the trail, landmarks, shadows on the hills. Anything she could use to escape if she needed to. But every muscle in her body ached with exhaustion. She had no strength left to fight. Eli whimpered softly. Caleb slowed the horse instantly. "He hungry?" "Yes," Clara said, embarrassed by how raw her voice sounded. "I barely ate today either." He nodded once. "There's water and bread in my saddlebag." "We'll stop by the creek ahead." They dismounted beneath a wide cottonwood, where a narrow stream cut through the earth like a ribbon of silver. Caleb spread a small blanket on the ground and turned respectfully away as Clara fed her baby. She watched him from the corner of her eye, while Eli drank greedily. The cowboy knelt by the water, refilling his canteen, giving her space with a deliberate care that confused her more than any roughness would have. When she was finished, he handed her a piece of bread without meeting her gaze. "Eat," he said. "You need strength." She hesitated. Then hunger overruled fear. She ate slowly, each bite steadying her shaking hands. After a moment she whispered, "Most men wouldn't have stopped." Caleb glanced at her then. "Most men aren't me." It was not arrogance, just a fact spoken plainly. They mounted again and continued west. The land widened into rolling prairie, broken by scattered mesquite and distant mesas. The sky deepened from gold into soft violet as the sun began its descent. Clara watched the horizon, her heart heavy with memories of the farm she had lost, the life that had vanished with Thomas. Finally, fear she could no longer contain slipped out. What do you expect of me?" Caleb did not answer right away. When he did, his words surprised her. "I expect nothing tonight. You and the boy will eat, sleep, and rest. Tomorrow we'll talk." "That's it?" "That's it." Her grip tightened on her baby. "And the year? The service they said?" "I didn't buy a servant," he said firmly. "I stopped an injustice. That's all." She dared to lean forward just enough to glimpse his face beneath the brim of his hat. His jaw was set in quiet determination. It was the face of a man who had already made peace with his choice. When the ranch finally appeared, it felt like a mirage. A modest wooden house stood against the open land, its porch wide, its shutters worn but cared for. A small barn sat nearby, and a fenced corral held a handful of horses and cattle. The place was not grand, but it was solid, safe. Caleb helped her down with a steady hand. She flinched at the contact out of habit, then realized he had already pulled away, respecting her space without comment. Inside, the cabin was simple and clean. A table made of thick oak planks stood near the hearth. 2 chairs, a narrow bookshelf filled with ledgers and a few worn novels, a single bed in the far corner, and nothing else. Clara froze. "There's only one bed," she said quietly. Caleb followed her gaze, then nodded. "You'll take it. I'll sleep in the loft." She stared at him in disbelief. "You don't need to," he replied simply. He lit the lantern and set it on the table, then left her alone to settle the baby. True to his word, he did not linger. From above, she heard the soft thud of him arranging a thin mattress on the loft floor. That night, Clara slept with her son clutched against her chest, her senses sharp even in her dreams. Yet for the first time since Thomas died, she was not cold. The walls did not creak with threat. No footsteps crept toward her in the dark. Only silence. The following days passed in uneasy calm. Caleb rose before dawn each morning. She heard him move quietly, saddle his horse, and ride out while the stars still lingered in the sky. When he returned near evening, he brought food, flour, beans, milk, sometimes fresh meat, and always placed it on the table without ceremony. He never touched her, never raised his voice, never made a demand. Confusion became Clara's constant companion. On the 3rd day, while she washed clothes in a metal tub near the porch, she finally gathered the courage to ask what haunted her most. "Why me?" Caleb shifted the coil of rope he was mending. "Because you needed it." "That's not enough," she said softly. "Men don't throw money away for nothing." He paused. "I'm no man of God. I won't pretend I'm some savior. But my sister once stood where you stood." Clara's heart tightened. "What happened to her?" He exhaled slowly. "She didn't get a chance like you did." Silence fell heavy between them. From that moment on, Clara understood that Caleb was not just rescuing her from circumstance. He was defying a past he could never change. Days slowly stitched into weeks. Little by little, Clara began to help with small things, mending clothes, preparing meals, feeding animals when Caleb was away. Each task was a quiet reclaiming of dignity. She was no longer standing on an auction block. She was standing on solid ground. Eli grew stronger. His cries softened into laughter. His eyes followed Caleb across the room with fascination whenever the cowboy passed. One evening, when Eli reached out with uncoordinated fingers and latched onto Caleb's thumb, the tough rancher froze as if struck by lightning. Clara watched as wonder flickered across his face. "He's trusting you," she said gently. Caleb swallowed. "I ain't had a child hold my hand before." From that day on, something shifted. Yet the shadow of the town still loomed. One afternoon, as Clara hung laundry under the hot sun, two riders appeared at the edge of the property. Dust streamed behind their horses. Her heart plunged into her stomach as she recognized one of them, the bearded bidder from the auction. Caleb dismounted slowly beside her. "You ought to leave," the man sneered. "That woman and that boy don't belong to you." "They belong where they are," Caleb said flatly. "You paid for service, not ownership," the man snapped. "You ain't fulfilling the contract." Caleb's eyes hardened. "I paid to stop a crime, and if you've got a problem with that, you can take it to the dirt." Hands hovered near gun belts. Clara clutched Eli in terror. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. Finally, the bearded man spat into the dust. "This ain't over," he said, turning his horse. As the riders disappeared, Clara realized something chilling. The danger she thought had ended at the auction had only changed its shape. And the safety Caleb offered was now priced with blood if it had to be. That night, as the wind whispered across the prairie, Clara lay awake listening to Caleb pace quietly in the loft above. For the first time, fear returned, not of being owned, but of being fought over. Yet beneath it stirred a fragile truth. She was no longer alone, and neither was he. The warning the bearded man had delivered clung to the ranch like a bad storm cloud that refused to move on. For days after the riders left, Clara felt the tension in the air, thick, waiting. Even Eli seemed to sense it. He startled more easily now, whimpering at sudden sounds, clinging to her as though the quiet itself had teeth. Caleb said little, but she noticed everything. He checked the windows at night. He cleaned his rifle with slow, precise movements at the kitchen table. He began riding the perimeter of the ranch twice a day instead of once. Every gesture carried the weight of readiness. Still, life continued. Clara gathered eggs at sunrise. She learned which horses were gentle and which would nip at careless fingers. She learned how to knead dough until it no longer stuck to her hands. And she learned, slowly, the rhythms of Caleb Hart's life. Quiet, disciplined, built on routine and solitude. One evening, as the sky burned red over the fields, Clara cooked, while Caleb mended a broken fence rail near the barn. Eli lay on a blanket by the open door, kicking his feet and cooing at drifting dust motes in the light. It was ordinary, peaceful, and that terrified her. Because Clara had learned the hardest truth of widowhood. Peace never lasted. The next morning, the trouble arrived with the mail. The rider from town approached just after dawn, his horse lathered with foam. He handed Caleb a folded paper without meeting his eyes and left without a word. Caleb read the letter in silence, his jaw tightening. "What is it?" Clara asked. "A summons," he replied. "Council hearing." "For what?" "For interfering with a lawful auction." Her heart skipped. "They can do that? Fine. They already are." The hearing was set for 3 days later. Those 3 days felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting to be pushed. Clara barely slept. Every shadow outside the cabin seemed to shift with menace. Every creak of the barnwood sent her pulse racing. She dreamed of auction blocks and ropes, and voices chanting numbers that never stopped rising. On the morning of the hearing, Caleb saddled his horse in silence. "I'll go alone," he said. "No," Clara replied immediately. "If they're judging my life, I'll face them too." He studied her carefully for a long moment, then nodded. "All right." They rode into Red Willow under a hot, pitiless sun. The town square looked the same as it had on the day of the auction. Same dust, same buildings, same crooked gallows at the far edge most people pretended not to see. But the eyes on them had changed. Men paused in their work. Women stopped mid-whisper. Children stared openly. Clara felt the weight of every stare like stones pressed into her back. Inside the council hall, 3 men sat behind a raised desk. The bearded bidder stood near the front, arms crossed, his expression smug. "This man," he said loudly, pointing at Caleb, "has violated the terms of a lawful sale. The widow was purchased as labor, yet she performs none. The agreement has been ignored." Caleb spoke evenly. "The auction exploited a grieving widow and an infant. No law should protect that." One of the councilmen sneered. "This town survives on hard rules, not soft hearts." Clara stepped forward before she realized she was moving. Her voice shook, but she forced it steady. "You took everything from me, my home, my land, my husband's tools, even my right to stand free. And you call it law?" A murmur spread through the room. The bearded man laughed. "You were property the moment your husband's debts fell due." Caleb's hand twitched near his gun. The lead councilman raised his palm. "Enough. The issue is simple. The terms of purchase were violated. The buyer must either submit the woman back to town authority or face penalty." "What penalty?" Caleb asked. "Loss of property," the councilman replied coolly, "and possible arrest." Clara's breath caught in her chest. Caleb did not hesitate. "Then I submit to nothing," he said. The room erupted into shouts. Outside, rumors spread like wildfire through dry grass. By evening, half the town believed Clara was a witch who had bewitched a rancher into rebellion. The other half believed Caleb was planning to steal more free labor from the auctions. Both sides agreed on one thing: neither of them could be allowed to stand. That night, as they rode back to the ranch, Clara finally broke. "This is my fault," she whispered. "If I had never been bought, if I had never come here." Caleb slowed his horse. "Stop. Your land, your life, everything is being threatened because of me." "Clara," he said quietly, "everything was threatened the moment I chose not to be silent. You didn't create this. You revealed it." Her tears blurred the land. 2 nights later, the fire came. They smelled smoke before they saw it. Thick, bitter smoke that choked the air and burned the throat. Caleb threw open the door to find flames crawling up the side of the barn like living creatures, devouring the dry wood. Clara screamed. Caleb ran for water, but the fire was already too strong. With a roar, the barn roof caved inward, showering sparks into the sky. One of the horses screamed in terror before falling silent. Eli wailed in Clara's arms. From the darkness beyond the firelight, laughter echoed. Cowardly voices. Hidden faces. They fled into the open field as the barn burned to ash behind them. The heat blistered their skin. Sparks rained down like fiery snow. When the fire finally died, Nothing remained but blackened beams and glowing embers. Clara fell to her knees in the dirt, sobbing. "This is what protecting us costs," she cried. "Death, loss, ruin." Caleb knelt beside her. He placed one steady hand on her shoulder. "No, this is what hatred costs." At dawn, they buried what remained of the animals in silence. Something hard changed in Caleb after the fire. The soft restraint faded. The man who rose that day was no longer only a protector. He was a fighter. He began to prepare. He rode to distant neighbors who owed him loyalty. He armed men who had been pushed aside by town authority. He formed a quiet resistance among those who knew that Red Willow's laws fed on the weak. Clara watched this transformation in fear and admiration. At night, when Eli slept, she and Caleb sometimes sat at the table in silence. One such night, she finally whispered what had been burning in her chest. "If they take me back, they won't," he said. "If they kill you, they won't. You don't know that." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the walls he kept so carefully built around himself cracked. "I know this," he said softly. "I won't let your son grow up believing men sell his mother like cattle." Her heart shook at his words. Tears slid down her face. "Why are you risking everything for us?" His voice dropped to almost nothing. "Because I lost someone once, and I learned what it costs to do nothing." And for the first time, Clara saw that beneath the strength, beneath the calm authority, Caleb was a man haunted by his own failures. That was the night the town finally made its decision. At dawn, riders surrounded the ranch. 10 men, rifles raised. The bearded bidder at the front lifted his hand. "By order of the council, surrender the woman and child." Caleb stepped forward alone, unarmed. "You'll step off my land." "This land," the man laughed. "The council has seized it." Clara stood in the doorway with Eli pressed to her chest, her body trembling. Caleb didn't move. The first shot rang out. It missed, but the message was clear. War had begun. The morning air was cold, sharp enough to bite through the thin layer of dust clinging to Clara's skin. The smell of gunpowder, already lingering from the first shot the day before, had not faded. Caleb stood at the edge of the ranch, his gray eyes fixed on the approaching riders. 10 men, weapons drawn, pardoned faces twisted with greed and entitlement. Behind them, the bearded bidder rode with a sneer that could cut metal. Clara clutched Eli tightly to her chest, feeling his tiny body quiver. She had spent 3 days helping Caleb prepare the ranch for this inevitable attack. Broken fence posts had been replaced with stout beams. Holes had been dug in strategic spots to slow any charge. Every ridge of land, every tree, every shadow had been considered in Caleb's meticulous mind. "I don't know if we can hold them," she whispered, her voice trembling. Caleb turned to her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. His fingers were warm and grounding. "We can," he said. "We fight not because we want to, but because we have to. Stand with me, Clara." Fear struck like ice, but determination pushed her forward. She found herself helping Caleb load the rifles, stack rocks for cover, and even tie Eli in a small sling on her back when it became too dangerous to hold him. The baby had cried at first, sensing the tension, but slowly grew quiet, lulled by her heartbeat and Caleb's calm presence. The riders circled closer. Dust swirled around their horses' hooves, making the world look hazy, almost surreal. A single shot rang out from one of the men, grazing the earth near Caleb's boot. He didn't flinch. Clara's breath caught. "They're going to kill you," she whispered. "They'll have to try," he said, voice calm but fierce. "I'll not let them take you or Eli. Not 1 inch." The first attack came suddenly. One of the men broke from the line, riding hard toward the fence where Caleb had placed hidden spikes. The horse skidded, but the man managed to stay on. Caleb's rifle cracked with precision. The shot hit the horse's shoulder, bringing the rider down in a cloud of dust. Clara gasped, her hands trembling. Eli squirmed in the sling. Caleb rushed to the injured man, dragging him away from the others. Another 2 men dismounted to flank the ranch, but Caleb had already anticipated them. He grabbed a second rifle, firing with practiced accuracy, forcing them to retreat behind cover. The battle became a dangerous dance of strategy and instinct. Clara followed Caleb's instructions, throwing rocks, pulling Eli to safety behind beams, and keeping a watchful eye on every approach. The bearded bidder, furious, attempted to rally his men, but Caleb's planning left them frustrated and exposed. Hours passed, though to Clara it felt like days. Sweat and dust coated their faces. Her hands ached from gripping Eli, but she refused to let go. Caleb's patience never wavered. Even as one of the attackers breached the outer fence and tried to rush the cabin, Caleb intercepted him, wrestling the man to the ground and forcing a surrender. Finally, the bearded bidder rode forward alone, rage boiling in his eyes. "You'll regret this, Hart. You think you can defy the council?" Caleb's voice was calm, but steel edged every word. "I don't care what the council thinks. You tried to own a woman and a child. I stopped that. That's all that matters." The bidder raised his gun, but Caleb moved first, tackling him from the saddle. The struggle was brief, brutal, and decisive. Caleb stood over the defeated man, breathing hard, but his eyes never left Clara and Eli. The rest of the riders, seeing their leader defeated, fled in disarray, leaving only the echoes of their curses behind. The ranch, though damaged, remained standing. Clara sank to her knees, clutching Eli, tears streaming down her face. Relief crashed over her in waves, mingling with exhaustion and disbelief. Caleb knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly, "for now." Clara looked at him, seeing not just the cowboy who had rescued her, but the man who had risked everything to protect the fragile lives of a widow and her child. She realized in that moment that her fear had been replaced by something deeper, something warm, steady, and undeniable. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt the possibility of hope, not for herself and Eli, but for a future that was no longer dictated by the cruelty of others. As they worked together to repair the fence, tend to the horses, and rebuild the barn, Clara noticed a subtle shift in Caleb. The hardness in his eyes softened when he looked at Eli. His movements, once precise and guarded, now carried a gentleness that revealed a man capable of deep care. Eli, sensing the change, giggled and reached for Caleb's hand. Caleb knelt, letting the baby's tiny fingers wrap around his thumb. Clara watched, her heart swelling with emotion. That night, after the battle and the work, they sat together by the fire. Clara fed Eli while Caleb warmed his hands over the flames. Silence stretched comfortably between them, broken only by the baby's coos. Finally, Clara spoke. "Why did you risk everything? Why fight them instead of letting them take us?" Caleb stared into the fire. "Because I know what it's like to lose someone you love, to cruelty and injustice. I couldn't live with myself if I let that happen to you and Eli." Her heart clenched at the raw honesty of his words. She realized that she was no longer a passive witness in her own life. She had fought, even in small ways, alongside Caleb, and in doing so, she had found a new strength. As the stars emerged over the prairie, they both understood something unspoken. They were no longer just protector and rescued. They were a family, bound not by law or obligation, but by choice, courage, and trust. Outside, the prairie lay quiet, the echoes of the town's hatred fading into the night. Inside, the fire crackled, illuminating a small, fragile world where love and safety could grow. And for the first time in months, Clara allowed herself to imagine a life that was truly her own, a life with Caleb, with Eli, and with the hard-won hope that they could survive anything together. The days following the standoff were quiet but tense. Red Willow had learned a hard lesson. Caleb Hart was not a man to be trifled with. The council had sent no further riders, and the bearded bidder had vanished from the town entirely. Yet peace was not immediate. Clara could still feel the weight of eyes on her from afar, whispering rumors that drifted across the prairie like smoke. Inside the Hart Ranch, life slowly began to take shape. The barn had been rebuilt, stronger and sturdier than before, a symbol of resilience. Clara helped with the finishing touches, painting the wood and arranging stalls for the horses. The rhythm of daily work was grounding, each chore a small victory against the fear that had once dominated her life. Eli thrived in this new environment. He laughed freely now, his cries a rare occurrence. The ranch became his playground, tall grass to crawl through, gentle horses to nuzzle, and the endless sky for him to watch with wide-eyed wonder. Clara found herself smiling more often, her laughter mingling with his and echoing across the open fields. Caleb, too, began to show a side of himself that few had ever seen. He taught Clara how to shoot a rifle safely, how to care for the horses, and how to read the subtle signs of the land. But most importantly, he taught patience. He never pushed, never demanded, and never spoke in anger. His presence was steady, grounding, and protective, yet gentle, a balance Clara had not thought possible in the harsh frontier. One morning, as the sun rose in golden streaks across the prairie, Caleb and Clara sat on the porch, watching Eli crawl toward the chickens. Caleb passed her a cup of coffee, and she sipped in silence, savoring the warmth and the moment. "I never thought I'd see a sunrise like this," Clara said quietly. Caleb's eyes met hers. "What do you mean?" he asked. All of this, safety, peace, feeling like life is ours again." He nodded, his gaze drifting to Eli. "Sometimes it takes losing everything to know what really matters." Clara leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. The weight of fear and grief she had carried for months seemed to lift, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of hope. Days turned into weeks. Caleb and Clara fell into a rhythm. Work at dawn, meals together, evenings by the fire. Caleb often watched Clara as she tended Eli, his expression softening in ways he rarely allowed himself to show. She was no longer a woman in need of protection only. She was a partner in every sense, capable, resilient, and courageous. One afternoon, a distant figure appeared on the horizon. Clara's heart skipped, a flicker of fear returning. But as the rider approached, it became clear that it was a messenger from a neighboring ranch. Caleb intercepted him and returned with news that the town council had quietly rescinded the auction ruling after the failed standoff. No further attempts would be made to claim Clara or Eli. Relief washed over Clara like rain. Tears sprang to her eyes, and Caleb embraced her, holding her tightly, as though he could absorb all the past month's pain and worry. "It's over," he whispered. "No one can touch us now." That evening, as the sky blushed with sunset, Caleb and Clara prepared a proper dinner in the kitchen. The scent of roasting meat and fresh bread filled the cabin. Eli babbled happily in his high chair, crumbs smudging his cheeks, and Clara laughed, a sound Caleb realized he had longed to hear for months. After dinner, they moved to the porch. Caleb strummed a simple tune on a worn guitar he had pulled from storage, and Clara hummed along. Eli clapped his hands in delight, bouncing on Caleb's lap. The world outside felt infinite and safe, the stars above twinkling like guardians. It was in that quiet night, with only the sounds of the prairie and the soft laughter of a child, that Clara realized she was no longer the fragile widow who had been auctioned off. She was a mother, a partner, and a woman who had survived unimaginable hardship and emerged stronger for it. Caleb, too, changed. The man who had arrived at the auction as a stranger, armed with nothing but resolve, was now a father figure, protector, and a partner. He had opened his heart, allowing someone else in, an act of courage that mirrored Clara's own bravery. Weeks later, they celebrated a small, private ceremony on the ranch. Not a wedding in the traditional sense. There were no guests from town, no elaborate dress or minister, but a promise. A promise to care for each other, to protect Eli, and to face whatever the frontier might throw at them together. Caleb slipped a simple ring onto Clara's finger, and she placed one on his. They exchanged no grand speeches, only quiet words that carried a lifetime of meaning. "You saved us," Clara said, her voice steady, eyes glistening. "No," Caleb replied softly. "We saved each other." Eli, oblivious to the significance of the moment, reached for Caleb's hand and laughed. The sound was pure, unburdened, and it echoed into the night. In the following months, the Hart Ranch flourished. Crops were planted and harvested. Animals thrived, and Clara and Caleb built a life grounded in trust, respect, and deep affection. Their love grew quietly, strengthened by shared trials and the knowledge that they had each faced death and cruelty together. Clara often reflected on the day she had stood on the auction block, terrified and helpless. She could hardly believe she was now here, safe, loved, and empowered. She had found more than a protector in Caleb. She had found a partner who respected her, cherished her, and allowed her to reclaim her dignity and purpose. Caleb, watching her tend to Eli one afternoon as the sun painted the fields in gold, realized that he had also found something priceless, a family, a bond that was not forged by law or debt, but by courage, compassion, and love. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, full of promise and uncharted paths, and for the first time in a long time, Clara, Caleb, and Eli could look ahead without fear. They had survived the auction, the threats, and the flames, and now they could live freely. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the ranch in a warm amber glow, Clara and Caleb stood together, holding Eli between them. Their lives were no longer defined by what others had tried to take, but by the choices they had made, the love they had nurtured, and the hope they had fought to protect. And on that quiet prairie, with the wind whispering through the tall grass and the stars beginning to emerge above, they began their new life, whole, united, and unafraid.